Okay, here we are. Welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about tissues and histology. So, tissues. Histology is the study of tissues. It literally means ology, study of histo, tissues. A tissue is defined as a group of similar cells and extracellular products that perform a common function. So, a bunch of cells of the same or similar cell type, all in the same area, doing the same sort of things. We have four major or primary tissue types. These ones you want to know, boom, 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 easy. Epithelial tissue, muscular tissue, nervous or neuronal tissue, or neural tissue, and connective tissue. These are all the individual types of tissue, and we're going to kind of move through these. We'll talk about epithelial tissue, we'll talk about muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and then we'll talk about connective tissue. We'll talk about them in the general, and then we will get into a few examples. What I would like you to do is really dig into your textbook and into each of these, really identify how to locate and identify them when looking through a microscope. Know their general function and where you might find them in the body, and then really be able to identify them in the microscope. Let's start with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is basically tissue that covers and protect. We find epithelial tissue on the outer surfaces of all sorts of things, the body, skin, the outer port. All of our body cavities are lined with epithelial tissue. All of our visceral organs and our organs are lined with epithelial tissue. Any tubes or ducts within the body are carrying substances from one place to another are lined with epithelial tissue. Some of that epithelial tissue is actually releasing or secreting products into the body. And then vessels, all of our blood vessels are lined on both the outside and the inner lumen of those vessels is covered with epithelial tissue. So here we have a sample of a bunch of epithelial cells. And so the tissue, remember, is a bunch of cells of similar type, all working together. So this layer, let me get my pointer, here we go. This layer up here is really the epithelial tissue, and it's sitting right now on top of connective tissue. You can also see here within the blood vessel, there's also some epithelial tissue lining the inside of that blood tissue. But I really want to talk about up here, and I want to focus on some of the characteristics of epithelial tissue. All epithelial tissue is what we say is cellularity. Okay, that's a big fancy word for lots of different cells of the same type, all kind of connected together. There's different structures that hold them together, gap junctions, and different ways that some of these will share information in between each other. But all these tissues are all these cells are packed in together, similar types of cells packed in the same area. Epithelial tissue is also characterized by its polarity. Now, polarity, the word polar, I think of polar as like separate. Okay, when things are polarized, they're separated. So think of like our world has two magnetic poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, and they're separated in a direction. You think of our political climate is separated. It's very polarized. You have left and the right, and it's separated and polarized. You could also think of polarity meaning directionality. So there's some directionality to these cells. They have an apical surface, like the upper surface, and they have a basal surface. That is what we might consider maybe the bottom of the cell. You also have a lateral surface. And remember, the word lateral means to the side. So epithelial cells are polar. They have polarity to them. Epithelial tissue is typically avascular. The prefix a means without or not. Vascular refers to blood vessels. So this blood vessel is actually going through the connective tissue, but the epithelial tissue is avascular. It is without blood vessels going through it. And so that means that any nutrients that needs to get to these cells is going to pass into those cells and between those cells through the basic process of diffusion. Um, Epithelial tissue is also characterized by its innervation. It is highly innervated, meaning that there are lots of nerves and sensory cells that are within epithelial tissue. It needs to sense the outside world, and so it is highly innervated. And then epithelial tissue is attached to a basement membrane, right? So this basal surface, that lower surface, is connected to this basement membrane, and that attaches it to other types of tissues. In this case, we see it's connective to connective tissue. And then epithelial tissue has a high regeneration capacity, meaning that when these cells die, they're exposed to the environment, they die, they come back, and they're always regenerating. Remember that epithelial tissue is designed to cover and protect. So allowing it to regenerate is very protective of the underlying tissue beneath it. Some types of epithelial tissue. When we talk about epithelial tissue, we want to characterize it in a few manners. One of those manners is the number of layers of cells. So cells packed on top of each other. Simple epithelial tissue simply has one layer, as opposed to stratified. Stratified means more than one layer thick. So multiple layers, sometimes just two, sometimes many, many, many layers. So we talk about simple epithelial tissue and stratified epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is also characterized by its shape. And so when we look at cells through a microscope, I kind of imagined a researcher. I don't know why, but I'm going to give him kind of like a surfer attitude. It's like looking through these cells, and he's like, "Hey, this one looks squished. Let's call it a squish cell." Well, squish doesn't really sound super scientific, so let's use a scientific word for squished. We'll call it squamous. The word squamous means squished, and when you see a squamous epithelial cell, you'll notice that the nucleus looks squished like a pancake or a pupusa or something like that. And then I think of this same grad student looking in his microscope. So, oh, look at these cells. They just look like little cubes. Look at them. Let's call them cubed tissue. Well, we can't really call them cubed. Again, it doesn't sound very scientific. So we'll call them cuboidal. Cuboidal cells are generally cubed shape. And when I'm looking through the microscope and I'm looking for cuboidal cells, I'm looking for cells where the nucleus is nice and round. Okay, so nice round nucleus generally means we've got a cuboidal tissue. And then the same research he's looking through, he's like, oh, look at these ones. They look all tall and skinny like columns. Let's call them column shaped. Well, we'll call them columnar. How about that? Columnar are long and narrow, and then sometimes those nuclei are stretched out and they look columnar. Now, we have epithelial tissue categorized by its number of layers and by shape. And what we can do is we can combine these terms. So we can talk about simple squamous epithelial tissue. That is epithelial tissue that is one layer thick of squish-looking cells. Or we could have stratified squamous epithelial tissue. That is squish-looking cells where we have lots and lots of those pancakes sitting on top of each other. You can have simple cuboidal, you can have stratified cuboidal, you can have simple columnar, and you can have stratified columnar. So these are kind of the basic ways that we categorize epithelial tissue, and now we can look for them in the microscope. One other type of epithelial tissue that doesn't really fit in this is called transitional epithelial tissue. And that changes. I don't know what I'm trying to write there. That changes shape. Okay. Transitional epithelial tissue changes shape. And so it can be squamous at one point, and it could be columnar at another point. When you think about where that might be necessary, the first thing that comes to my mind is like the bladder. When the bladder is empty, you have these tall, narrow, columnar looking cells all stacked next to each other. But when that bladder fills with liquid, those cells need to transition and stretch out into squamous looking cells. And so that allows the bladder to hold all that fluid. So that's transitional epithelial tissue. So, uh-oh, uh-oh. I'm going to pause here because and we're back. So not sure what happened there. It looked like, I don't know, my pictures weren't coming up. Anyhow, here we can see the epithelial categorized by shape. So we see these squished, or I'm sorry, by layers. Here we see just a single layer of cells of epithelial tissue. Here we see many layers of cells, actually two different types of tissue, but these ones all look squished to me. You can see the nuclei in the center of those cells. These ones down here look like cuboidal cells. You can see there's nice round nuclei in them. Again, we can classify by shape, right? Here's a squamous looking cell all squished, cuboidal, and that columnar. See that football shape looking nucleus in the center there. This is a great flowchart to study and practice with. You talk about the types of epithelial. We talk about simple and stratified, the shapes, all the shapes. And then there's a few other types, special types that we'll talk about in a bit. So here are some examples from a microscope. On this one, I'm looking at this dark disc right here, and that is the nucleus of one cell. And you can see that that nucleus is not stacked on top of anything else. So this would be an example of simple squamous. Here's another cell next to it. Here's another cell here, another cell here. And notice that it's just one layer thick. You might find this in like the alveoli of the lungs, where oxygen and carbon dioxide need to pass through these barriers. This is an example of simple cuboidal, and let me orient you a little bit. Imagine you had a stack of straws, and you turn those straws so that you're looking right down the middle of all those straws. So here you have a straw here, a straw here, a straw here, a straw here. Each of these tubes is created by a few simple cuboidal cells next to each other. And so you can see these nuclei, the dark circles. Those are the nuclei, and they're nice circles. And that tells us that it is cuboidal. So here's another example over here. You know, the cell is not exactly a cube, but it's more cuboidal in this. And so you find these tubes oftentimes are simple cuboidal. And again, it allows for nutrients to either get emptied into the tube or to be absorbed from that tube into the extracellular tissue between there. There's an example there. Here we have another tube. Okay. This time, look at our cells. They're long and narrow. And again, just one layer on top of each other. They're connected next to each other. So on the lateral surface, they're next to each other. So these would be examples of simple columnar epithelial tissue. All right, here we have a whole bunch. Now, all these dark dots in here, those are nuclei. And so you can see many layers of nuclei. And if you look in here, these ones look sort of squished. And so, oops, let's go back to those. Those are squished. And what you have here, probably the surface, like skin, something like that, where this outer layer, it can be scratched, and these kind of extra bits of tissue, they can slough off, and you have all these other cells behind that as they kind of move out towards that apical surface, they're going to get squished and squished and squished. That's stratified squamous. Here we're looking at stratified cuboidal. I kind of think this one looks like rotten corn, but I see some circular looking nuclei, and I see them stacked on top of each other. So this would be an example of stratified cuboidal. Here, again, this would be, we can see here, one layer of cells, and then you can see a second layer of cells on top of it. So there's a layer there, there's a layer there. Notice if you look really closely, these nuclei look like little footballs on their ends. So we would call these stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Here's some more complicated versions of epithelial tissue, and these are great terms to show off on the weekend to let your family and friends know how smart you are. You could talk about transitional epithelial tissue, right? Remember we talked about that, how it might be columnar and then it may transition to more of a squamous looking shape. This one is a mouthful, and that's a great one to talk about is stratified squamous epithelial tissue with keratin, or sometimes it's called keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And so if you look here, you're like definitely stratified. You see many layers of nuclei. If you look right along here, you should see lots and lots of those squished nuclei in many layers. And then above here, you see kind of this white layer. And it sort of looks like the outlines of cells, but no nuclei. And that's because these cells have died and they've been infused with a protein called keratin. Keratin is a protein that makes up your fingernails and hair, and it fills these cells on your skin. So if if you ever have dry skin or ashy skin and you just kind of scrape that layer of skin, you're not scraping your living cells, you're scraping mostly this keratinized epithelial tissue off of there. And then down here we have what's known as pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Pseudo is a word that means not really, or sort of like, but not actually true, or fake. So pseudo-stratified means not really stratified or fake stratified. So, and we call this pseudo-stratified because it looks like we have nuclei sitting on top of each other, like they're actually separate layers. But really what's happening is those nuclei are being packed in so close to each other that kind of like put egg yolks next to each other, and then one slips on top of the other. And so they're next to each other, but the nuclei are kind of stacked. So the cells themselves are just next to each other, but when you pack them in, the nuclei kind of fold around so they can all fit in there. And so you can also see on here is an example of some cilia hairs projecting from the apical surface. So that's your pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Let's move into muscle tissue or muscular tissue. We can use those terms interchangeably. Muscle tissue is tissue that is designed to produce movement. And muscle tissue is special, unique from other cells because muscle tissue has the ability as a cell to contract itself, to make itself smaller. So muscle cells can contract and shorten. We have three major types of muscular tissue. We have cardiac muscle, which is found only in the heart and has special features that allow it to be heart muscle. We have smooth muscle, which is found around all our organs and in vessels and tubes within our bodies. And we have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle gets its name because it is mostly attached to the skeleton, attached to bones in our body. Here's an example of cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac tissue is characterized by being striated. Striated means it has a striped appearance, and it is also autorhythmic, or it is involuntary, is the word I'm looking for. Involuntary means that you don't get to decide when your heart muscle contracts, right? You do not get to control your heart when it beats, when the muscle contracts, if it beats faster, if it beats slower, if it falls in love. You don't have the ability to control your heart because it is involuntary. The cells in here are branched, sort of Y-shaped. You can see that if you look in there. And they're typically smaller or shorter than skeletal muscle fibers. One thing I want to point out in here, if you look in here, you'll see these faint lines every once in a while. And these faint lines are called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs are actually little channels that allow electrical signals and nutrients to be shared between muscle cells. Because think about your heart. It's beating, I don't know, something like 60 to 80 times every minute, every hour of every day of you're probably going to be 80 to 100 years old. That's a lot of beating. And your heart, crazy enough, never takes a day off, right? So when these cells start to get tired, they can share nutrients with other nearby cells. In addition, this autorhythmic, these cells generate, when we study the heart a little bit more, we'll see that electrical signals are passed through these cells, and these intercalated discs allow that signal to be passed almost immediately so that the signal can get across the heart and it can beat fast or beat immediately. Smooth muscle, right? If you look here, you kind of see how it gets its name. Smooth muscle, unlike cardiac muscle, is not striated. So it does not have that sharp striped appearance. They're typically short, wider in the middle, kind of tapered at the ends, this kind of fusiform look to it. And they are also involuntary. So remember, cardiac muscle is involuntary but striated. Smooth muscle is involuntary but not striated, right? So we cannot control our smooth muscle, but it allows for movement of food, blood, sperm, things like that through our organs. This is skeletal muscle, typically the type of muscle that we're most associate with. And it is characterized by these striped appearance, right? Clearly striped appearance. So that's striated. And skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle that is under voluntary control, right? You get to decide when you're going to flex a muscle, when you're going to open your mouth, when you're going to turn your head. That is voluntary movement. And so that is skeletal muscle. It typically is actually multiple nuclei in each periphery fiber. So sometimes there's lots of nuclei in there together. Let's move on to nervous tissue. Nervous tissue or neural tissue is tissue that communicates by sending electrical signals. Okay, there are two major types of neural tissue, and we talk about the neurons, which have been called the functional cells. They're the ones actually doing the communicating, and they're supported and they're surrounded by another type of tissue called glial cells or glia. And I always remember this one. I think back to one of my favorite TV shows of all time about these high school kids who sang in a band or sang at school in a club. And there's always one or two students who were really getting the headlines. But there's always the backup singers, and they were always supporting each other throughout that. And that show, if you remember, was called Glee. If you haven't seen it, I'm sure it's streaming somewhere. But I remember glial tissue are always supporting cells. Let's take a look at some neurons. So these are neurons here. So this might be a single neuron right. Oh, let's go back. Single neuron right here. This would be called the cell body. The nucleus is inside there. You have these dendrites hanging off, and you have this long axon. And these cells would then send a signal. That signal would then get communicated to another cell, to another neuron, so on and so forth. And so we can connect and send signals very rapidly through our bodies. And then these are glial cells. Again, you've got some neurons here, and then you've got cells in between that are supporting that. Okay, connective tissue. We talked about epithelial tissue is designed to cover and protect. We said muscular tissue is designed to produce movement because of contraction. The cell is able to contract. Neural tissue sends electrical signals and it can communicate to other cells. So what else do we have? Well, we have connective tissue. Does it connect? Some of it does, but then kind of everything else is categorized in this group called connective tissue. And so something that is unique about connective tissue, they are all surrounded by some sort of matrix, some sort of substance that characterizes these cells. It could be calcium deposits, it could be water. So some sort of matrix surrounds these cells. Several types of connective tissue. Blood is actually a connective tissue surrounded by a matrix of water. Adipose or fat tissue is connective tissue surrounded by fat deposits or oily lipids. Bone is a connective tissue. Bone cells are separated and surrounded by a calcium matrix. Tendons, these dense fibrous tissue, and ligaments are also connective tissue, along with several other things. We also talk about cartilage. That's near and dear to me. I've had the cartilage in my knee destroyed, and it doesn't grow back very well. So let's talk a little bit more about connective tissue. We can define it as like the most diverse, right? Because we put all sorts of tissue or cell types into this category. It's abundant, widely distributed, structurally varied of the four main tissues. It's the glue of the body. Includes things like blood, tendons, ligaments, fat, bones, cartilage. These are all connective tissue. All connective tissue can contain cells, protein fibers, and ground substances. So this is like the matrix that we were just talking about. The different cells are in different types of connective tissue. Examples include fibroblasts, osteocytes, adipocytes, right? Remember that the word cyte refers to cells. So osteo means bone, cyte means cell. These are bone cells. Adipocytes, these are fat cells. Protein fibers. So there are basically three types of protein fibers. You have your elastic fibers that are able to stretch. The collagen fibers are a little more stiff. And then you reticular fibers in there as well. And this ground substance, this matrix, is a mixture of proteins and carbohydrates with various amounts of salts, different salts and waters that go in there as well. So here we are looking at some connective tissue, some of its components. You might have a fibroblast up here. So this is a fat cell. You can see the nucleus here, and then this big glob of fat. Macrophage is a type of white blood cell. And then you have these mesenchymal cells in here, along with these fibers, reticular fibers, collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and we call this the extracellular matrix. So that's that matrix we were talking about. Some of the functions of connective tissues: physical protection, right? For example, bones and fat, protecting the organs that they surround. They might provide support and structural framework. Again, bones are the framework of the body. That cartilage supports the trachea, cartilage in your ears and nose, cartilage between your bones or at the ends of your bones. They help to bind structures. For example, ligaments connect bone to bone. Tendons connect muscle to bone. That's one to remember. Storage, right? Adipose stores fat. Fat is a substance that is really, really good at storing energy. And it's going to wait and store that energy till it absolutely needs to. So as you get a little older, like myself, it's really hard to get that fat out of storage. Development of connective tissue arises from the mesoderm. We're talking embryology, and two types of embryonic connective tissue: the mesenchyme, the source of all connective tissue, and then this mucous connective tissue. That's found only in the umbilical cord, and those are for embryos developing in the womb. We can classify connective tissue in a few different ways after birth, kind of three categories. So you have that connective tissue proper, actually connecting tissue, connecting things, one structure to another. You have supporting connective tissue, and then you have this fluid connective tissue like blood and such. So again, this is a way to think about connective tissue and organize it. You have that mesenchyme, you have that proper connective tissue, and some examples here. You have the supporting connective tissue like cartilage and bone, and then that fluid connective tissue, blood, and all the different types of cells that flow in the water of our blood. Here's some examples that you might see. So here is blood cells. These are actually red blood cells. They don't look red on when we stain them. These ones kind of look grayish. These bigger, darker cells are also blood cells. Those are types of white blood cells or leukocytes. Adipose, right? So here we're actually looking at a blood vessel. These are our adipose cells. And if you can look on here, oops, let's go back here. We can find some squamous, or not even squamous, but we find some nuclei on those, and then they're surrounded by, these are just big globs of fat that is storing energy. This is a couple types of bone cells. The star-looking cells is that compact bone, those osteocytes. And we look at spongy bone in like the bone marrow. You see some other cells there as well. So again, we saw this at the beginning. I would highly recommend going through and studying the organization. I might even suggest that you go and make your own concept map. And the way I suggest doing it is like the big concept is tissue. And of course, we have our 4 types of tissue, and each type of tissue, you want to connect it with a line, and then like a little word or phrase that tells you something about this. So I think of it like sort of making a sentence. Tissue that covers and protects is epithelial tissue. Tissue that contracts and produces movement is muscle tissue. Tissue that sends electrical signals is nervous tissue. And then everything else, or tissue that's surrounded by a matrix, is connective tissue. And I might suggest, as you study this, to make your studying an active process and go through and try to build this flow chart with some connective words that help you to remember each of those different things. And that is a lot about tissue. And we'll study that more. And I hope that was helpful.